All right, in this lesson, we want to look at Kenneth Burke's idea of logology. So we've met Kenneth Burke now. We want to carry that forward and try to get a sense of what he's doing in his logology, which he introduces in his book, The Rhetoric of Religion. And so, obviously, this is going to be a deeply religious vision, because what we're going to find is that basically Burke is going to take the idea of logology, the study of language, the study of words, and he's going to say the best way to do that is by exploring it with relation to theology. Let's take a look at how all of this unfolds for Burke. So, looking at logology, Burke says, look, I'm interested in how language functions, how it works, and one of the things that you have to immediately notice when you pick up the world of language is that language is, in essence, different from nature. Nature doesn't really name anything. It really doesn't seem to be particularly acquainted with the idea of language or the complexities of language. You don't find it out there everywhere. So when you have this kind of a thing, that thing right there is really not the sort of thing that has a sort of overwhelming sense of a need to name the stuff that's down here, right? That object right there is a real thing, and we have to distinguish in our mind, and this is central to Burke's idea. You have to understand that the thing that is out there in the woods, this thing growing there, that is different from the way we name that thing. So the object here is a material reality. You meet it in nature. You can find it out there. You can stub your toe on it, all right? That thing that you go out to and that you pick fruit from and that you chop down and burn to stay warm in the winter, that object, that thing is natural. It occurs in nature. It simply is nature, being natural. It's a material reality in the world. When we approach that material reality, however, we notice something different. We, human beings, tend to give that thing a name. And the moment we give it a name, Burke says, language has come into the picture. And the first thing that you're going to see is that this word, tree, is different from that thing that grows out there. So the word is not the thing? Sure, absolutely. But Burke says, when you look at this, what you discover is that language, this idea of tree, is in some ways transcendent. It rises above the natural order, and it does that in several different ways, and that's what Burke wants to begin to unpack and explore in logology, because Burke thinks understanding how the word tree is transcendent, rises above the object that grows in the woods, understanding that process is central to understanding how language works, how language functions. So he says, look, take one quick example here, all right? I can take the word tree and I can do things with it. I can make things happen with it that I cannot make happen, at least not easily or quickly, with that object that's growing in the woods. So, for example, if I don't want one tree, if I want more than one tree, hey, that's really simple. I just put an S on the end of it. And all of a sudden I've gone from a tree to trees. All I have to do in language is add that s at the end of the word, and suddenly I have manipulated a reality somewhere in somebody's mind. In fact, I don't have to just do it with 2 trees. I could do it with 5,000 trees. Okay, now Burke says, if you want to understand, think about what you did to make a tree into 5,000 trees in language. Really, it was quite simple. You put that s at the end and you added 2 words, 5 and 1,000. Bingo, you're there. Now you've got 5,000 trees. But stop. Think about what would have been involved, Burke says, trying to turn one tree out there in nature, one of those things in the forest, into 5,000 things in the forest. Okay, well, that process would be entirely different, utterly unlike what we did with our words. Our words are freer. They're easier to work with. They rise above the reality because we can do things with the word that in nature would require effort and time, energy, almost unimaginable time to turn a tree into 5,000 trees. I mean, that would just go on and on and on and on and on. So somehow the word is actually easier to deal with than nature, than the realities, the material conditions that are out there. So this word is not exactly, directly, somehow mysteriously connected to these objects out here. We can do things with the word that we cannot do with nature, or that we cannot do easily with nature. So the first thing that Burke wants you to notice is that language is somehow separate from nature. It seems to be something other than natural. You see where that's going, right? It must be something metaphysis, metaphysical, supranatura, supernatural. Language functions as if it were itself a participation in reality that is not found in nature. And that sets Burke to wondering, okay, wait a minute. How does that happen? How did we human beings come to that place where the word tree seems to function outside of the conditions of nature? So nature is that thing growing out in the woods. Tree is a word you and I exchange between ourselves that seems to magically transfer thought from one mind to another. It's as if the word tree, it's as if naming a tree tapped into some kind of reality that is not material. It's not found out there naturally in the world. And Burke is grappling with, and he's wrestling with that idea. Okay, that's where he's starting. And he says, I can kind of see how language becomes transcendent at one level. So, for example, let's take an easy word like grace. Okay, grace is a perfectly common word in Latin, gratia. It means literally just a favor that somebody does for you. Just a kindness. It means a friendship act. Some kind of esteem, just a recognition, or some service that somebody does for you. I know you're sick, so I got your mail and I put it up at the, by your front door to help you out. That's a grace. It's just a friendly gesture, a kind of favor, a kind of, sometimes it's an obligation, a duty, but basically it's just this common word. It doesn't have any particular power. But Burke says it is occurring, however, in a culture that does have this concept of a transcendent realm. There is a reality up above our natural world. In other words, Burke recognizes that the old Romans, when they're talking in a world that is very much Plato's world. When he talks about the transcendent realm up here, he means Romans, many Romans, assumed that the world looked like it did when we talked about Plato, that there are these realities that are more real than the material world of nature that we run into all the time over here. These realities that are more real than the natural world that exist just outside of nature, just beyond the border of the natural world, and that human beings down here living in their average everyday world are trying somehow to come to understand. That transcendent realm that is up there, Burke says, remember, they can't talk about it. That's what we mean by transcendent. It goes above time and space. So the transcendent realm itself, there are no words for it. You can't talk about it. So you have to borrow language out of ordinary life. And you have to essentially promote that language. You have to bring that language up into the transcendent realm and sort of massage it, kind of play with it until it comes to mean something deeper, something more real, something more transcendent than you had in the natural world. And indeed, you lift the word grace, it just appears, it comes up right out of the world of nature there, and that becomes a word we begin to change, to shape, to massage, and slowly over time, that word grace turns into something else. It doesn't mean favor, it means God's favor. It means esteem, some kind of recognition from God. It means an undeserved service, an undeserved gift, something that's given to you without any merit on your part, okay? Grace is basically brought up into the transcendent realm, and it is transcendentalized. It is made a part of that transcendent realm, okay? So Burke says, hey, I can see how the word is functioning, every word at one level is functioning in a transcendent way, and I can begin to see a little bit of how that happens. Because the transcendent realm is beyond speech, beyond telling, we take ordinary words and we bring them up into that transcendent world, and we work with them up there to see if we can make them capture some idea of this divine, transcendent, godly world that's above us. Now, here's the catch, Burke says. Once a word has been brought up into the transcendent realm, and it's been theologicalized, okay, it's been turned into a theology, a way of theologos, so a word about God, right? Theos, God, logos, word, theology. Once a word has been theologicalized, it's become a word that helps us talk about God, then that new divine meaning that we've put on that word, guess what happens? Well, that bleeds back down into ordinary language. And all of a sudden, now you can talk about, grace in a sort of literary way, a poetic way. Oh, there's a poetic grace to that story. You can talk about grace in a personal context, a behavioral context. You can talk about, they're an extremely gracious host, or their movements are graceful. And all of that, this sudden new way of using grace in an ordinary way is tied to and is sort of infected, Burke says, by the divine realm that the word has visited. Now, if you will think back to our early texts on Plato, you remember the myth of where goes up into the divine world and comes back down. You remember our discussions of the Phaedrus, where the soul struggles to go up and catch a glimpse of the divine world and comes back down. Once it comes back down, it's carrying a sort of glimpse of the holy, of the divine. And Burke says that's what's happening in language. Language, once it is brought up and we try to retool it to talk about the unspeakable realities of the divine world, once we've done that to that word, it sort of flows back down, and that divine ambience begins to infect the ordinary use of the word too. So there's a full cycle. So the word grace, when used about the transcendent world, is always an analogy. It's never a direct, real comparison because, of course, the transcendent world can never be directly spoken of. It's outside of time and space. It's beyond the reach of language. So when we use ordinary language, like a word like favor or friendship, and we use that to talk about the divine world, we are always using a word as an analogy. And Burke says once that analogy is complete, and we begin to think that we can talk about this word in a way that does capture something about the transcendent world, then that meaning, that infected divinity, falls back down into our ordinary use of the word. That's one of the ways, Burke says, language begins to take on the idea of transcendence, of being a powerful force for tapping into a different kind of reality. That is part of what Burke is dealing with when Burke takes up his idea of logology. Now, I said at the beginning, logology is going to be a kind of analogy, a sort of parallel to the idea of theology. All right? And remember, theology, we said, it's words about God. Okay, so Burke says, good. We understand theology is a sort of words about God. Okay, great. That's spectacular. Here's what I want to do. I want to take up the idea of logology. I want to explore words about words. That's what's valuable. That's what's important to me. I'm not so interested about God. This is not a concept that ever captures Burke's imagination, right? But he's very interested in language. And so he says, I see, given this transcendent property of language, and he's talking here about just ordinary language like the word tree, right? Given the fact that it has a certain kind of an analogy of transcendence about it, he says, I'm interested in how that happens. And the place to look, he says, is theology. Because when we start forming logos, words, about God, that's where we run into this transcendent principle. Because God, it's never nameable, right? And therefore, I want to see what kind of principles are going on when we turn our attention from God to words themselves. Now, Burke is going to run into a problem with this, okay? What he's going to do is he will, as he grapples with this, and after he publishes his famous book on the rhetoric of religion, he begins to realize, oh, wait a minute, hold it. In the end, if God cannot be spoken of, then theology isn't really language about God. Theology doesn't work like that. In the end, theology is not words about God. Theology is words about the Word, God. So it's not God himself that theology is discussing, Burke says. It's the Word God. It's the meanings that we have brought to or found in or been told to associate with God. Theology is our words about that Word, God. Okay, now, you with me? When we move from theology, words about God, to theology, words about that Word, God, remember he's doing right now to God, the Word God, exactly what he did to the word tree. He's saying we're not talking about the reality, even if he doesn't even take a stand whether there is or is not a reality. But that's not what we're talking about. If there is a reality, that is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about in theology is how we talk about the Word, our understanding of God. Now remember, words about, logos, that complicated word, which means reflection, it means considerations, it means evidences, reasoning, reasons, argument. It has all these complicated meanings. So word, logos, words, plural, logoi, we're thinking about all the reasons, reflections, considerations about, well, same thing. Reasons, reflections, considerations. So when Burke moves from theology, words about that Word God and how it's used and how it works and how it functions, and he begins to talk about words about words, he's actually turning his attention now, as he will explain to you, he's turning his attention to reflections about reflections, reasoning about reasoning, thinking about thinking. And it's, of course, you very quickly realize, okay, wait a minute. If I do this, if I do to logology what I did to theology, if I find that I'm not talking about words about God, but words about the Word, God, what happens to logology when I go, oh, I'm not talking about words about words, I'm talking about words about the Word, words. Okay, hold on. Even for Burke, and believe me, it takes a lot to fluster Burke, even for Burke, he recognizes this is an infinite regression, we call it. I mean, there's just no stopping that. Once you start that, well, then you need to talk about the words about the words about the words, right? And there's no stopping it. So he says, you've got to put the brakes on somewhere. We've got to get a handle on this, or we're never going to understand either language or religion or the relationship between them. And so he begins to say, look, when I talk about reasoning, here's the bottom line, all right? This is what I'm finally, in the last analysis. This is what I'm after. I'm after about reasoning about how meaning happens. How do we come to understand what it means to think, to reason, to use language? That's what I'm after. That's what logology is supposed to tell us. And the only way it's going to tell us that is if we look very carefully at how words function in a theological, transcendent frame. That should tell us about how words function in an ordinary frame. And again, Burke is going to say, I'm not saying there is or there isn't a God. I'm just saying the way we talk about transcendent reality should show us a great deal about the way we talk, period. Because reasoning seems to follow that same path that you see in theology. It's always got this transcendent element. And we have to isolate that transcendent element, and we need to bring that transcendent element forward to understand the baseline of what's happening. Because that's the only way we're ever going to understand how meaning gets into our heads, how meaning gets associated with words. He's going to give us a method for doing that. And it's one of the really important things we need to focus on.